So here we'll go over manual rates and experience rates, and more so manual rates and how to actually calculate the manual rates. Manual rates are expected claims of group based upon group demographics and risk characteristics. So experience rates are from your own history of claims for the particular group, whereas manual rates are the projected claims that you think could occur in the future based upon your current group characteristics and demographics. So this takes into account the industry pool data, or if you have data from other clients, you can pull those data points in to try to get to an expected claim number that you feel confident in that this will also be true in the projected rate period. And so this is what we call our manual projected PMPM. Our experience-based projected claims cost PMPM is upon what the historical claims have been for that particular group. And we typically credibility weight the manual and experience rate, PMPM, by, and there's a specific formula that's also mentioned, to get to an overall projected allowed or paid claims that you then input to get to a gross PMPM. And we have allowed versus paid. Allowed is paid after you take into account cost sharing. So if you want the total actual claim amount from the ground up, that is your allowed amount. We have tabular method, which is mainly used for long-term non-inflation sensitive items. So this you do some product of claim cost and probability. So you have the probability of getting a specific claim, and then you have the cost associated with that particular claim, and then you do the sum product of that to get to your final uh, cost, PMPM. Now you have also a build-up method. Build-up method you do inflation is for inflation sensitive products. You add up the PMPMs for the individual services. So it's good with when you have copays and when you have because you can apply that individually per service. So you may have a copay per service, you apply that to that service itself, and then you add up all the PMPMs for each service to get to your overall total PMPM. And PMPM we know is util times the claim cost divided by that 12,000 to get to your per member per month. Density is you use that when you have deductibles and OOP limits. It's the total claim of an individual per year. There's no service breakdown. That's why it's essential that you use density for deductibles and OOP limits. In network, you have copays, out network deductibles, and you can typically do a weighted average of these depending on the percentage of in network versus out of network. Re-rating, you're taking from current to future rates. So if you have a specific loss ratio currently and you want to take it to a future loss ratio, that is re-rating. So how can you adjust the current premiums to get to your desired loss ratio? And you take the ratio of the loss ratios, just target over desired, and then you adjust the premiums accordingly. You also want to take into account sometimes there's also a lifetime loss ratio, so you may increase the loss ratio or the premiums for, let's say, year 2+, but that may you may be conflicting with the lifetime loss ratio requirements. So you also want to make sure you have the lifetime ratio requirement as well as the loss ratio for years 2+ as well. We have block rating, which takes into your account the net premium, and then it factors in all of the different layers. And whether these are the expense sales, these are the taxes, these are all of the expenses, the different expenses, plus the possible profit that you also want to have on when you're charging this premium, minus the investment income that the insurer is getting. So your expected cost, what on average will it take to insure this individual or these group of individuals, and you're adding into your admin expenses, sales commissions, possible profit that you want to add, and minus your investment income. That is all of when you aggregate those, you get to your gross premium. And now typically you have just going over life claims in general, you have your life claims, you have your death benefit, which is the amount that you get if your beneficiaries will get upon your death, which is typically a premium amount that is paid monthly. And it's given to us as per $1,000 of coverage. And it's the monthly net premium, which we also call as PMPM. Now, for many of experience, when we do experience rating, or not even experience, not experience rating. When we do manual rating, sometimes we get data, let's say from another client or from another group of individuals that are not they don't fit the profile of the current group that we're actually rating the premiums for, we're creating rates for. And so the what you do is you take the rates of those other clients or of the other client B that you're using their data for, and then you normalize that data. So you remove all of the age, gender, geographic region variables that were included in that rate, and then you normalize. So now this is your baseline rate, and then you apply your age, gender, geographic region factors upon that baseline rate. So you're taking the client data, client manual rate, and then you're saying we want to remove all of the different factors that it was specific to that client, to that client that now doesn't apply to the current group that we are actually profiling now. And so that is how you get to from your manual rate of another client, and you convert that to a baseline manual rate that you have, right? And then you can convert that to the manual rate that is appropriate for the group of individuals that you are pricing for. And now we have experience rates. So manual rates, we talked about, this is the set rate that we are going to have for this group given these group and risk characteristics. Experience rate, now we're forgetting all the group risk characteristics. We're saying what's the actual historical data, historical claims that this group has actually experienced, and what is their history, and we're using those to then project in the projected period what those rates, what those claims would look like, what those projected claims would look like, and deriving the premium from those projected claims. So you're adjusting your experience rate from the experience period and then projecting that forward. So you can apply a trend factor depending on inflation, and we have unit cost trend, mix of services utilization depending on how much services are being used. And now when we talk about adjusting our manual base rate, so this is what step is this in? This is when we take our data from another client, we've done our denormalization, we have our baseline manual rate, and now we're applying all these age, gender, geographic region factors to get to our manual rate for group for the client for the current group that we are insuring. And so now how are we adjusting the manual rate? The baseline manual rate is two ways: CPD claim prob distribution and cost model. So for CPD, what we're doing is we have aggregate claims. Aggregate claims. So that's why anytime we have a deductible, we're looking at per member annual claims. That's why we want to use CPD, because those deductibles actually apply at the per member annual claims level, right? Next, we have cost model. And in cost model, we're doing the copays, because the cost model has the breakdowns by services. And because they have the breakdowns by services, you can actually apply the copays to each service, and then you can build it up. CPD, you have range of claims, you have frequency of the average annual claim. So it's an entire claim distribution, and you can apply the deductible to the aggregate claim. Or if it was broken down by services, you can't aggregate all of them and then apply the deductible. Here we're saying these are the range of claims. We're bucketing these different claims into these categories, and then we're saying that in a given year, these percentage of members will have claims that are from X to Y range. And if they do have a claim X between X and Y range, we know that the average annual claim, which should be between X and Y in that range, is going to be a certain number. And then we can apply the deductible, and then we can see the value of the deductible. And then we do the sum product, and that's how we can get the expected future costs of of uh, right of this policy and what the payout would be, and then we can get our net premium from that. And then cost model is we break it down by service instead of saying by service we mean inpatient, outpatient, physician, and then within those lab, X-rays, whatever services are available. And now let's talk about trend. Now there's a trend is how the claims will change over time. How the claims will change over time. We have unit cost trend. We have util trend, so how often these services will being used. We have severity. Severity is the intensity of the treatment. So, for example, a 30-minute doctor visit in 1 year may turn into an hour doctor visit the next year. So the intensity of the treatment actually increases. And for example, a surgery could be more intensive, and because it's more intensive, you now need to have more resources being allocated to that surgery. So the cost of that surgery will obviously increase. So here we have severity, understanding how severity changes, understanding how utilization changes. So some services might get used more often than others. So we may expect a certain increase in, let's say, X-rays or a certain increase in lab exams for some particular reason due to possibly demographic shifts, changing needs, consumer preferences, consumer needs. We have unit cost trend, which just takes into account the typical inflation, healthcare inflation, typical healthcare costs are rising. This is like your background default trajectory of the increase in prices. We have util severity mix of services referring to the fact that the consumers would use inpatient sometimes more often, outpatient versus physician. So it's the range of services that they would use compared to utilization, which is how often, if given that they do use the service, how often will that service be used? So mix of services is the composition of all of the services and categories of services that they will use. So they may use inpatient or physician or some group of lab exams more in a certain year compared to others. And then that will also influences utilization, but utilization is more given that certain that lab exam will now be utilized more heavily in the future. So you have unit cost, trend, utilization, severity, mix of services. That encompasses trend, which is all about how claims and claim costs will increase over time. And we use that trend to then layer on a projection factor from the costs from our experience period, move that forward to our costs in our projected period. So what are we building here? What are we building here? What are we estimating? At a high level, we are estimating future expected claim costs. How are we doing that? We are doing that by calculating two rates, manual rate and an experience rate. Manual rate is from our group characteristics, it's like almost a heuristic or a formula you're following based upon these group characteristics, these group risk factors. We have this proposed manual rate. You can get data from the industry. It could be an industry pool. You could be from a client that you then denormalize and then apply risk characteristics that are equivalent and prevalent to your group, and that becomes your manual rate. Your experience rate is your previous historical claims, that projection of that forward, trending that forward to get to your projected experience rate. Then you're blending these two due from some credibility factor. You may want to give more weight to experience rate if you feel those are more credible, and you have a long good history of claims, and you want to maybe give more weight to manual if it's you only have a few years, or those claims may not be credible enough. And so you have this some blending of weighted average of manual and experience rates to get to your credibility weighted final projected costs PM, which is the amount that it would take the insurer to insure one member per month how in projection of their costs, and that is your net premium. You take that, you add in your expenses, you add in the profit provisions that you want to have, and to get to your gross premium, and this would be the amount again after your all of the other variables, expenses, investment income that we would factor in after you calculate your net premium, and this would be net premium, again, as we mentioned, is your estimated future cost of covering this individual per month. And it doesn't even have to be per month. It depends on the problem. But you can do it for a year annually and then convert it to monthly depending on the question. And now we will go over VP3. L5, controlling images, and the current honest is five religious vows. Can't be overcome by one's own thought process, perceived faults, doubts, conviction in God. And that is what makes one deceitful, is if he doesn't disclose weaknesses in observing five religious vows, doubts and conviction of God, perceived faults in the son, and thoughts that cause falls include attempting to eradicate that thought, but it still remains. But then it will still, and then it arises again. That causes a fall, but it does not cause a fall if that it's eradicated through a thought process. And once it arises one time and does not arise again. So this thought is arises, it's eradicated through another thought process, and it does not arise again. So then the thought doesn't cause a fall if it is immediately eradicated. If it is not immediately eradicated and it still remains, and if it doesn't arise for 15 days or a month, but then it arises suddenly, then that will cause a fall. Then that will cause a fall. Now, the three means to controlling Indriyas and Andhakara, we have Shastras, so those help realize the glory of God and Son. We have the Son to learn the techniques for controlling the Indriyas. Now, what controls which? What controls which? Is it the physical Indriyas? Well, yes, it is the physical Indriyas. They cannot be controlled by controlling the Andhakara alone. The Andhakara can be controlled by controlling the physical Indriyas alone. So internal state depends on what the external state is. So the external state is dictated by the indriyas. So the indriyas, that external state, once the external state is controlled, once the indriyas are controlled, then the internal state, the antakaran, will also be controlled. And so if you control the external state, the physical indriyas, don't let them indulge in the vishayas, and the antakaran becomes frustrated and thinks that, hey, this type of enjoyment is not going to be possible in this life. So the physical indriyas are controlled by observing the niyams, controlling diet, observing these different dietary vows, and deliberately tolerating cold, hunger, and thirst, and engaging in these different discourses. And the antakaran is controlled by contemplating God's glory, atma-realization, meditating on God's form. So even though we do have this controlling indriyas, which will also control the antakaran, we also have separate measures to control each of these. And these are the separate measures that control indriyas and antakaran respectively. Purifying the company one keeps. So this is all about what type of company you should keep, what type of company should you avoid. So what company should you avoid is Satsangi Paramat's faith in God, but only considers themselves to be the body, as egotism, desires for worldly activities. Sadhu who says discouraging things, and then the second one is okay, he may speak encouragingly, but then he also emphasizes his own efforts. He does not acknowledge the strength of God and does not feel that in endeavoring and pursuing this path I want to perceive please God. He does not have that intention. So these are the companies that you should avoid. These are the sadhus whose talks you should also avoid, and now the companies who you should seek are the sadhus who constantly criticizes oneself, maintains constant vigilance on any swabha. And now one flaw contains all the flaws is identifying oneself with the body. One virtue containing all virtues is Atma realization. 6 levels of faith, Sarvikap, Nirvikap, lowest, intermediate, highest. Lowest is that, okay, if God exhibits all these lust, anger, greed, egotism to the same extent, then we will have it. But if it's even slightly more, even if it's slightly more, if he has these different vicious natures, then faith will decline. Faith will be immediately shattered. Now the second level of faith intermediate is even if he has these different vicious natures double to a greater extent, the double extent to that of humans, then that faith still remains firm. And the highest is never doubting any action of God, even if you were to engage in the most in the in the most terrible of all actions. Reverence and condemnation, you can think of this as someone falling down, and as he is falling down, he's thinking about aversion for the punch ratios, and he's thinking about, and if he does receive these sumptuous food, eats it, does not enjoy it, and he does have these fine clothes and luxurious bed items, honor and any pleasant object, his mind does not become troubled by any of it. So developing aversion for these bunch of issues. So you have knowledge of God's glory, you have Atma realization, and then you have Vairagya. When you have these three, when you do have these three, then that is how you develop aversion for the bunch of issues. And the result of understanding the glory, result of this, and when you do understand this glory, is you have access to everything, access to absolutely everything. Piece of iron touched by Bada's money absolutely transformed into gold. You have four types of spiritually eminent or eminent spiritual people. A comic book has these four qualities of the Dharmagna Vedagya Bhakti. And even if these four are not perfect, only one can be predominant, then it's bhakti coupled with the knowledge of God's glory. So it's bhakti with knowledge of God's glory. If that remains, then all four will be developed. And so why is that efficient? Why is that sufficient? Is because one who realizes that sees that if all of the other devs follow God's commands, then how can I not follow his injunctions? And then dharma, Jnana and Vairagya also increase through that understanding. Through that understanding. Now we have examples of these exploding bhaktis again, which is the only thing you need out of these four, even though all of these four are essential. If you just have bhakti plus understanding of the glory of God, then you're able to have these these characteristics. And we have four types: small flame torch, lightning, on fire. We'll go over quickly just high level manual rate. So manual rate, experience rate, what are we doing for total projected future costs of covering this individual? We're projecting future claim costs. Projecting future claim costs. These are the claims that this member will, or these group of individuals who we are insuring will likely face in the future. And there's a tabular method to do that, where we do the sum product of the claim cost probability to get to our net premium amount. And we have a build-up method to do that, which is the PMPMs for each individual service. So for this service, we expect this utilization. For another service, inpatient lab X-ray, we expect this utilization. And for each of the service, this is the claim cost that we expect again in the projected period. And then if we want to get to a PMPM amount, we then divide by 12,000, assuming that the granular total is uh is from a yearly perspective, and it's per 1,000. It's util per 1,000. Density, again, deductibles, OOP limits, use density if that is the case. Re-rating is going from a current rate to a future rate and adjusting your premiums accordingly, depending on some loss ratio standard. And then gross premium again is net premium, and then you add on your fixed expenses, and then you divide by one minus profit and remaining expenses. And then you want to normalize data for your rating variables and your manual rate. One thing to note is sometimes your manual rate may already include some industry factors or some age factors or some geographic factors already included in the rate. And so what you don't want to do is then also add those same factors in to that manual rate. So you don't want to be double counting or having the effect twice, having the effect of, let's say, geography twice or any of these rating variables. You don't want to double the effect of that into your manual rate. So that could come up as a possible trap of having a manual rate where you've already included these factors, and but then you also don't want to add anything onto it again, add the same effect onto it again. And we talked about trend, unit cost, trend utilization, severity, mix of services as well. And then now in the second portion then is now all about like we have this experience data have this experience data, and then trending it forward, we typically, how do we trend it forward? We typically go from the midpoint of the experience period to the midpoint of the projection period, and then that is what we use as our trend, like the number of years that we are trending forward. Number of years we're trending forward, and these are your claim costs that you're trending forward. Again, healthcare and inflation, utilization, better technological services, changing consumer preferences. You want to make sure you take these into account when you're projecting from your experience period, like what it was not in your experience period, that will be in your future projected period, and you want to take those factors into account. Then you're developing the experience rate, and again that you credibility weight that with your manual rate to get to your total credibility weighted projected cost PMPM of right per member per month. VP3, the next one, V11, destruction of the Jeev. Harming any of these four God, devotee of God, Raman, one who is meek. If you harm anyone else, the Jeev body is destroyed, but the Jeev is not destroyed. So if why? Because these are sacred individuals, sacred entities, sacred individuals. If you harm anyone else, the body is destroyed by Jeev. But if you harm one of these four, Jeev is also destroyed. Jeev is also destroyed. And so that is why you shouldn't keep egotism before God or his devotee. So these are the two. Shouldn't keep egotism before God and his devotee. Now, why? Because egotism is the cause of anger, matsur, envy, slander, of all the other vicious natures. And so then goes into, okay, now egotism. Now even the bhakti of an egotist can be demonic. So even though bhakti, which relating this to the previous, even though that was the sole attribute to have to cultivate all the other three attributes of ekantic dharma, right? Even the bhakti of an egotist can be demonic. And now the resolution is to understand, have supreme affection, have intense love for the Supreme Worship. You do that, then you're able to realize the glory. You're able to realize the glory, and you're able to attain the from sort of state. So what was the paradox is without Atma realization, can't understand glory. And if you can't understand glory, you can't attain from state or Atma realization. So you do something that affects both. And then intense love, you realize self to be Atma, glorious Atma, and then direct realization, Atma realization. And attainment of all Purusharths, the attainment of all these spiritual endeavors is the fruit of all spiritual endeavors is satsang. And when do you have considered to have attained all of these spiritual endeavors? It is when you attain the company of the Sandani and you realize that the manifest form of God is and have conviction in the manifest form of God in the same way you have a conviction for the non-manifest lives, then they attain all the Purusharths. Stop there. Stop there.